This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD, Alan Turner. He's an artist and in Chicago, he does a lot of different performances, and he is also a game designer. Welcome, Alan.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Wizard. I'm glad to be here.
Alan, first of all, tell us all about your life as an artist and what kind of performances do you do, and what kind of music do you make? And you're very multi-talented.
Yeah, I guess one would call me a multidisciplinarian.
Mhm.
I get bored very easily, so I'm always finding new things to do and new skills to explore. So as an artist, let me see here. I'm all over the place. So when it comes to music, I do all this experimental work. I fell in love with synthesizers a long time ago, and so I built this small collection of synthesizers, and I work with my synthesizers and DAW and sampling and MPCs to just create different experimental meditative flows. I also dance. I'm a performer. As a performer, I do a bunch of things. I'm a storyteller, and I practice Middle Eastern belly dance, Japanese Butoh, some traditional native dance and West African dance. And I find ways to blend all those things together because they all, in one way or another, represent some of my personal identity and use those to express my storytelling on the stage.
Where did you learn all this dance?
Various places. My primary dance teacher was the wonderful Phaedra Darwish, who teaches belly dance here in the Chicago area. Um, there's my Butoh teacher was let me see, they used to go by Holly Oakley, then Holly Chernobyl, and nowadays it's Cyan. But if you look them up, you will find them in all three of those names. But they teach here. They were teaching here in the Chicago area. Now they teach in primarily in Berlin. And then I've just worked with other Butoh performers here in the Chicago area. I was part of the SS3 Butoh Festival that happened back in 2017, where we just had performances all over the city of Chicago, where people were just exploring various ways of expressing story and experiences.
Are there many artists like you that combine these different dances into personal expression?
Well, I'm sure there are. Just in my own practice, I've run into lots of people who, particularly when it comes to the belly dance, the Rakshaki, they will have that as a foundation, and then other dance forms that they've learned over the years will find its way into their stuff. But there are people who like to specialize and just really focus in on the cultural styles within those dance forms, and always keep it very specific to those cultural styles. But they lend themselves very easily to a blend.
Um, and what inspired you in the first place to pursue dance?
Oh my goodness. Like I said, I get bored very easily. And I'm a very kinetic person. Even as I'm talking, my hands are moving all the time. And so I have big emotional experiences and I have to get it out of my body. And so when something moves me, I have to find ways to turn that motion into some kind of kinetic experience. And then I either share it or just do it on my own. Sometimes I'm just dancing for myself, and sometimes I'm dancing for other people.
And these emotional experiences, when you were you always emotional? Were there experiences in that led to being more emotional? Like what in your experiences built up to the artist that you are now?
Oh, well, we don't have enough time for that. I guess the short answer is like so I grew up in the Pilsen neighborhood in the near west side of Chicago, and our family life was fairly troubled. There's lots of abuse. There's sexual abuse. There's physical abuse, emotional abuse, and so there's a lot of kind of learning to kind of make myself small and kind of contain myself, and so I wouldn't draw too much attention. But that builds a certain pressure inside of you over time. And as I got older, I actually didn't formally engage in dance as a full form expression until my late 30s. And that's when I came across Phaedra, and she invited me to take a class with her. Um, but yeah, so there's like all these things that I experienced as a young man, that I didn't have a way to really well express. And the only way I did it, primarily up until the dance came along, was I made things. I made, physical artwork, crafting things. I made games and play. And those are all ways to kind of get some of those thoughts out of my head. But they weren't quite sufficient because there's still this residue of things that were unexpressed. And then as I started getting more comfortable with my body, my life started to slow down. I moved into the Uptown neighborhood, um, and I was building a family. As I was watching my family trying to figure out how to be who they need to be, I figured the best way for me to do that was to express myself. And if I could model expressing myself, then my kids would also see that they could express themselves and however they need to be.
Well, you are a leader in your community, and did that leadership derive from having a family, and then you felt that you needed to lead your family to a better place, a better life for themselves? How did your leadership develop before we get into what you did as a leader?
Oh, well, again, coming from where I came from as a young man, I found myself back all the way through high school, doing work in soup kitchens and with youth programs. And that eventually led me to doing youth work. So for about 15, 11, for about 11 years, I was a youth worker within the Native community here in Chicago. I'm Black and Lakota. Um, and there's a lot of just kind of people skills that were developed in that space. A lot of compassion skills, and a lot of boundaries that were being developed. And so I came from a situation where I didn't grow up in a family that actually knew how to provide a lot of those boundaries and skills and whatnot. And so as I started my own family, I wanted to ensure that I was able to provide that for the people that I was in charge of, that I was taking care of. And then and so once I actually got a home, and that's the first thing I wanted to do was start in just engaging with my community, because I'm not the kind of person who just kind of sits in my little box and stays away from people. I love people, and but the community also had issues where there was a rising tide of gentrification, and there's a rising tide of violence in gang and drug activity that was happening, and they were kind of correlated. As the gentrification was picking up, the other problems were intensifying. And it hit a point where I believe what happened was they put up one of those police blue light cameras up on Argyle, and it caused in Uptown. I'm sorry, on Argyle, right by the Argyle red line stop, and it caused a lot of the drug traffic to kind of, instead of coming down Argyle where it had been coming at night, it channeled down an alley and kind of erupted right outside of my house. And I grew up when I was a kid in Pilsen. I grew up in a place where we had lots of gang and drug activity outside, so that wasn't new to me. But just the intensity and the disrespect. There was this sense of, at the very least, the people who were in the gangs kind of, to a certain extent, respected the people who lived in the neighborhood, and they maintained some boundaries and rules about what they did and who they did it to, and all this stuff.
And they kind of, before they would be sure try not to hit any innocent bystanders before.
Right. And just not, it's that idea that you don't mess around where you live, right? And but that was out the window in our neighborhood, as the police had gathered a lot of the dealers who are part of the open air market, and a bunch of freelancers came in, and those freelancers had no connection to the community. They moved in. They began to terrorize people who are living in the CHA housing units behind us, to a point where they had actually occupied the stairwells, so that people were afraid to go up and down those stairs. And we're always kind of hesitant to call the police, just because of things that can happen when the police come through with people of color. But it all kind of came to a head one night when they actually wound up with a multi-gang shootout in the alley right next to my house. I woke up, bullets were flying. My kids were in their rooms. Had to get everybody on the floor. And then I was livid because I thought I had gone so far to move away from the experiences I grew up with as a kid. And now here they were visited upon me and my kids were terrified.
Mm.
And so I shut off this really angry letter to the local block club. And part of that was because as the gentrification was happening in the neighborhood, we had issues as that block club was forming where they saw us and they saw the people who were hanging out on the street in front of our house or moving around in front of the street in front of our house, and they were presuming that we were part of that problem. And so I just
and you knew about that, and you knew about that too.
yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And I had spoken up about it, and I had actually gone to some of the block club events just so we can become a face so they know who we were.
Mhm.
But it wasn't until that event where I just said, hey, look, something has to happen or I'll have to start taking measures into my own hands. And at the time I thought I was alone in that frustration, but the president of the block club passed this on to the aldermen in the area and then to the local police chiefs. And then suddenly there were all these people who came out of nowhere to support the fact that everyone was frustrated, but no one had been speaking up. And
Mhm.
so it led to a gathering at the Kudus Agim synagogue over on Kinmore. And as I walked in, there's these 500 people gathered in that space.
Mhm.
And when I got up to talk, there's like this round of applause. I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. My mom was terrified I was going to get shot. And but people work together. People pull together. At the end of the day, it turned out everybody had something to say, and everyone wanted to live in a place where they felt safe. And there, we all pulled together. We had some block parties. We had people occupying the sidewalks and the corners for a long time just to have another presence there as opposed to what had been there beforehand.
Mhm.
And it was amazing that those forces, the drug dealing and the violence, that all began to recede and it's moved both north and south of our neighborhood. But for the first time, since I've been living there, and we had been there over 15 years at this point when that happened, and it was becoming the safer community that I wanted to be a part of,
Mhm. Wow.
and I got to be a part of making that.
Mhm. When you spoke about when you were small, you were timid, tried to not gather any attention, and then not to garner any attention so that you don't have to uh, get abused. But somehow you became a leader. What was the impetus not not many people are able to become leaders. Something must have happened to cause you to step up to the plate and start thinking that way.
I guess that's a good question. I think at the end of the day, there's two parts of that. One is I'm a giant. So even though I had this tendency to want to make myself small, that making myself small was also to offset the initial response people have when they see this 6'4" black man with a deep voice coming in the room. So it's really hard for me to hide, right? So there's that, and I've been told I have a big presence when I come into a space.
Mm.
And the other part of it is. Um, I like to get things done, and I like to build. I like to consider myself a world builder.
Mhm.
And when I see a problem, um, rather than just pointing at the problem and yelling at people about it, I start trying to figure out how do we get on the other side of the problem. And one of my personal big goals is always, how do I get on the other side of a problem and bring as many people as possible with me to the other side, right? So I'm not trying to erect new barriers. I'm trying to build new containers.
Mhm.
And that has also been informed by the work I do as a game designer, because that's all about world building and creating safe containers, these consent containers where people are taught what is accessible, what they can do, And when they're doing things that aren't what is expected, there's feedback to let them know that they should course correct. And when they're doing things that are expected, there's feedback to let them know this is the right thing. And so I like to try to find ways to bring that kind of play, that kind of feedback to my community spaces so that people can drop their guard a little bit and then kind of relax enough to express being who they are.
Mhm. Well, when you were young, you discovered art and creating things. So, what inspired you to take? Was it taking refuge in that? You found maybe you enjoyed it, you had a talent in it, or what happened?
There is medicine in that stuff. So when I was a little kid, um, a lot of that retreating was me also creating stories in my mind and just kind of playing on my own with whatever I had access to. Because we didn't have anything, we were destitute. We didn't have anything in the way of money.
Mhm.
So when it came to like toys and playthings, my toys and playthings were like the twist ties that came with the garbage bag, the paper towel tubes and rocks and marbles. And so I would sit for hours creating things that way. And then I would entertain my sisters by making puppet shows and creating doll houses and all, I would just take whatever detritus was around the house and find a way to turn that into something that we could play with. And it kept them occupied. Um, that led me, and I love stories. I love mythology. I love telling stories. And that led me to, as I got into college, I wound up taking some classes with some artists in residence around storytelling,
Mhm.
and particularly Shanta Narula, who is a pretty famous performer in the Chicago area,
Mhm.
and that helped to pull me out of my shell.
Mhm. Was there anybody else in your family that was creative?
Oh, I think everybody was creative on one level or another. My younger sisters were definitely into like crafting, music and singing. My older sister, she would sing all day long if given the chance to. And she was a bit of a crafter herself, making jewelry and things like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, I do luckily come from a tradition of making. People when we don't have anything else to do, we will put our energy into making something.
Mhm.
And then sometimes when um, there's there are big emotionalities kind of moving through us, we'll kind of take those things and put them into artifacts that we make, right? So drawing a comic, to express how frustrated you are, or
Mhm.
making superheroes that could beat up the problems, or creating songs and poetry to express sorrows or joys or whatever.
Mhm.
There's a lot of that going on. And my kids and my family does it too. My family's a family full of crafters and makers who make all kinds of things.
Mhm. So you were already kind of in that environment. So what you were doing wasn't uh, different from the rest of the family.
Yeah,
Just everybody has their own enjoyment of what they want to do.
right, right.
Um, you uh, how did you add on the experience of being alienated as a Black person, as a Native American? And when did you start uh, weaving that experience into your volunteerism, into your art?
Hmm. Well, my volunteerism was always within the, well, not always, but mostly within the Pilsen community as a child. So there was already interaction with people of color. In all cases, they're Black and Latinx people.
Mhm.
But for myself personally, I think it really came to, I was a big fan of fantasy and science fiction, excuse me, and I did lots of role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. I
Mhm.
had a I had a tight crew of friends and we played weekly, all kinds of games. But the thing that I noticed was eh, in the presentation of all those experiences, people like me weren't there,
Mhm.
right? If I picked up a new Dungeons and Dragons book, there wasn't a single person of color on the cover or anywhere inside the book, um, unless they were part of some expansion that focused on like an Africa-like space or a native-like space. And even then, it was focused around them being saved or conquered. And so I wanted to create something where I got to be, and people like me got to be seen.
Let me see if there's a caller that wants to ask a question. Hello, this is Wizard. How can we help you? And when you started game designing, how did you move into that?
Oh, so that's a funny story. I had been doing nonprofit work with Native American Educational Studies College, which used to be on Peterson and California. And they lost some grant funding, and I was without work for a bit. And so I was a stay-at-home dad. I was taking care of my first child was here, and we were trying to figure out how to move things and stay functional. And it was actually my partner. She came across in the reader an ad from a small company called Bungie in Chicago that they were looking for some people to do some tech support. So I was relatively familiar with the stuff that they did, and I went and applied for the support job. And at the time, they were a small independent game studio, and they did all their own publishing, their own tech support. Everything was in house. And I'd always done some tech work on the side just as a way to bring in extra money. So when I went in and applied, it turned out that I was one of the few people who showed up who actually had people skills. It wasn't just a fanboy or a fangirl. So I got that position, and that position wound up having me engage with the development teams because it wasn't just solving computer problems for people. It was also identifying issues that people were having with the games and figuring out solutions to patch the game. And so I was going back and forth with the dev teams, helping to figure out those patches. That eventually led to me doing some production work. And I already had a background, doing role-playing games. So that eventually I just moved into actually doing design work. And so the first game that I was actually a designer on was Mech Assault, which was so it's like a giant robot mech fighting game, but it was one of the games that launched Xbox Live. So I got to be part of that whole experience when the first Xbox was pushed out and the first Xbox multiplayer stuff was happening. And then after that, I just kept on doing it. And so I've designed for, I think, just about all the platforms, at least all the platforms that were around up until around 2012 or 13. But that also includes tabletop. I do tabletop role-playing games, publish my own role-playing game, done some therapeutic card games and board games. And I also do lots of social play work and working with teachers to show them how to do game-like learning in their classrooms.
So your interest in fantasy really helped you with the game development and the role playing.
Oh, absolutely. I firmly believe that people who have a good relationship with fantasy have a much bigger zone of resilience. Partly because if they've had any fantasies they've had an opportunity to engage with, that builds this emotional mnemonic, right? This remembrance of having achieved something great. And that's something that you can fall back on when you're up against hard times, right? So I think if you don't have fantasy in your life, if you don't have any kind of connection to that, everything seems so much more oppressive, and you don't have enough room to bounce around and explore your ideas with.
Well, sometimes when you encounter a problem, if you're interested in fantasy and role playing, don't you like apply role playing to solving that problem?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Just design principles are all about exploring what are the different angles that you can approach a problem from, and what's going to be the most salient solution, and how to deploy that solution. But that takes a certain amount of imagination to make that happen.
And where did you learn your tech skills?
All over. My first tech job was at Columbia College. I was a lab worker there in our computer lab. But beyond that, it was just with the advent of the internet, being able to get online and just learn things. I've had friends, like when I'm at home alone, and I've got extra time, I'm often on YouTube or Vimeo or Skillshare or something, watching videos on how to do something. I've had friends who call me tutorial Turner because I'm always just kind of absorbing extra knowledge and figuring out how to apply things. So I am self-taught in a lot of things that I do. And then once I got into the game industry, I got to work with other professionals who knew things, so that it helped me to expand my skill sets.
So you really didn't get any formal training, but you got like on the street training for your game design.
Yeah, yeah. I would say I learned game design on the streets. So I guess with the exception of I went to Columbia College when I graduated from high school, and there I was a film and animation person. And so that gave me a grounding in just the language for storytelling that I've been able to apply in all the other skill sets I've picked up along the way.
Did you get a scholarship to Columbia?
No, it was, well, I got, a Pell Grant and an ISSA grant, that kind of thing, but no scholarships. I actually had a scholarship to go to Lewis University, but that required me to either do, at the time I was an aspirant for the Christian Brothers, and they were funding it, but that required me to either do religion or science or law or business. And I didn't want to do any of those things. And so I decided I wanted to go to Columbia, which was actually a battle between me and my mom, because in my mom's mind, and I think this is common for people who are growing up in families of color, where the jobs that we're taught are jobs that are reasonable careers, are jobs that are all about you assimilating into, the common culture. And so people often look down on art positions and art careers. They don't actually see that as something viable. And so to my mom, she was like, I don't understand paying all that money to go to school to play. And then, fast forward, it worked. It worked out, and it's taken me all kinds of places. It's taken me all over the world. So,
as a leader, when what other problems did you have to address in Pilsen? Because after you got more public safety because of all the work that you did, then it started gentrifying. And then what other problems does Pilsen face now that you could actually do something about?
well, that's not Pilsen, that's Uptown.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In
Uptown. I'm
Uptown.
talking about Uptown. Sorry. Yes.
And I'd say that there is right now, Uptown faces a large gentrification push. I just coming home on the train now, there's been so many buildings that have been purchased and turned into high priced condos and whatnot that I barely recognize it from the train. There's also the issue of with all these purchases of these buildings. Uptown for a long time was a landing zone for immigrants coming into the city. And so there were large apartment buildings that would house, tons of families. And I remember at one point when, not long after we had all the stuff that was going on back in 2005 to 2007, there was a building that housed a large number of Bosnians. There were some buildings that held large numbers of Vietnamese, and some East Africans. And they got bought up, and so we had whole swaths of families. I think it was something like 200 families at one point that just disappeared from Gallaudet, which is the school across the street from our house, because they couldn't be in the neighborhood anymore. So watching the mix of the neighborhood has been amazing in the last, I don't know, I'd say the last 5 years, let alone the last 10 years, where it used to be when my kids went to a school, Gallaudet Elementary at the time, where there was so many languages and so many religions in that school. It was amazing. It was like a small UN. I really love that school. And then we look around outside and we see all kinds of people from all walks of life, rich and poor, black, white, brown, yellow, everything, all sorts of gender expression, because we were just north of Boys Town, just east of what's the Swedish neighborhood?
Edgewater?
Edgewater, not Edgewater, Andersonville,
Oh, okay.
which also had a very large lesbian population. We had various all kinds of mutual aid organizations in the neighborhood. You just got to see so many different types of people. And I see that dwindling more and more every day as the gentrification comes in. There's typically upper middle class or to upper class white families that I see moving in, and the families on the lower economic spectrum and on the color spectrum are slowly disappearing. So I hope we can figure out ways to curb that in a way. I used to say that for a long time, there's always been these pushes for gentrification in Uptown. And I used to say that Uptown was kind of like China, where people would invade China, but they would just become Chinese. Right? And I think Uptown, same thing would happen to Uptown for where people would come in, they'd try to change the neighborhood, and then they would just kind of get absorbed into the neighborhood. But I see the resilience of that absorptions receding, and the effects of the gentrification are really starting to kick in.
Are there any deconversions that you know of that, or there's not even that many condos in Uptown, right? They're mostly apartments.
There's large apartments. There were condos. So back in the I want to say the 2010s, there were lots of there's when the whole housing boom kind of built up and crashed. There were lots of buildings that turned into condos, but then they couldn't sell those condominiums, and so some of those buildings converted back into apartment buildings. And then more recently, there have been a lot of buildings that were either SROs. Actually, they're mostly SROs, and then there was the one building that's on Sheridan and Argyle that used to be housing for elders and people with
the HOME, housing for opportunities and maintenance for elderly.
Yes, I think it was that place, and that building got bought and turned into high price apartments. So, I'm not sure what it's going to look like in the next 5 years, but it's definitely a different place than it used to be. I'm actually a little worried for the whole Argyle Strip, just because I know that a lot of those stores, are family stores, and their capacity to maintain rent and property taxes with things starting to soar as all these these new buildings are coming in, and just the congestion is kind of crazy.
When we went to the Argyle Chinatown Chinese New Year parade, and we saw that they're remodeling the Argyle station, but a lot of those businesses along Argyle around that old station are vacant.
Yes, yeah, and that's really sad. It's really sad. Some of them have moved around. Some of our favorite restaurants like Sunwa moved around over onto Broadway, and Taipei Street is actually moved back onto Argyle. But there are lots of other mom and pop shops that they just shut down altogether. And then, of course, the pandemic hit everybody hard. So, yeah, I think, if anything, I think it was the pandemic that made the biggest difference, right? Because that caused so many people to have to exit. And that left these vacuums that new groups are coming in. And it's Chicago, right? So Chicago has always been the city of change. There's always been a certain level of migration of peoples back and forth. And most neighborhoods that we will look at and say, oh, that neighborhood has always been, X, Y, or Z type of people. If you look back in history long enough, you'll find that that's not true. Like Pilsen wasn't always primarily a Latinx neighborhood. At one point, it was Czechoslovakian, very Slavic folks who were down there, and it changed over time. So I know that the change comes, but I think when the change comes with such speed and such quick displacement of other people, I think that's problematic. And also when we have change coming that's purely economic driven, where people are coming in, they get property they intend to keep. They're not really investing in the community. They're just there to flip that property, make a buck, and then get back out. That's damaging, because eventually you wind up with stuff that is will create a bubble again, where we have new poverty in that space.
Let's talk a little bit about your work at the American Indian Center.
Oh, so I was actively involved with the AIC, I guess from 1989, all the way up through the mid 2010s, like 2015 or so was when I was a board member. And yeah, so I was a youth worker. I primarily worked with kids in elementary into high school. Did all kinds of intervention, did prevention work, did lots of storytelling, summer programs, camping programs, all kinds of stuff like that.
Mm. What inspired you to work there and help the youth?
Well, again, I mean, coming from the experience that I came from,
Mhm.
I saw other kids who were having parallel experiences, and in a way, it was my my way of building new family, right? Where I kind of engaged with them, heard their story, shared my story, and helped them figure out new ways to move forward. But it was, I think I have part of my nature is to want to support and give and be of service to people around me.
Seems as if you see the problems and then you hope to work toward the solution and you just step in and do it.
Yes, I do, and sometimes I do it too much. I joke sometimes and say sometimes I say yes about 7 times too many. Because I can, I want to help so much that sometimes I get a little overwhelmed, which isn't good because then if I'm overstretched, then I can't really apply my skills the way I want to apply my skills. Um, but yeah, I do love to see people blossom and to see people empowered to do things that speak to their heart and make them feel validated.
Did you have a leader or a mentor that guided you along the to what you're doing?
I guess there are lots of people indirectly that I saw doing good things. There's traditional civil rights leaders, Malcolm X's and your Martin Luther King's and all that kind of thing. But it was just kind people in general who I met on the street doing soup kitchen work, talking. I I have this thing where I feel like most of the people that I would consider to be enlightened and even holy people that I've met in my life have not been people who come from some big religious institution. They have been people who found a truth, and they've just been living that truth. So they have been street gardeners and youth workers and people who are just made themselves of service to the world around them. And so every now and then I would stumble across folks like that. A person who just comes to mind. There's a gentleman who was the interim director for the American Indian Health Services for a period in the early 90s, Paul Allen. And Paul was he's kind of an old hippie, old hillbilly. He's passed away years ago. But he was kind of a mentor for me. And I came in there, initially came over to AIC through a grant that was putting youth or young adults to work. And I came in to kind of help them figure out their database stuff. And then that turned into me doing prevention work. But Paul worked with me. He was also one of my street tech teachers, right? We would talk about just social work, things that were happening in the world, how to be a better person. And then alongside that, we would talk about technology. And he was the first person to sit down with me and show me how to build a computer. Came over to my house and we built a thing from the ground up, and I was hooked thereafter. Another person like that was this gentleman, Chris Drew, who also has passed away. And Chris is responsible for the fact that it is legal in Chicago for us right now to report the police doing things because he was a street artist and he would do these art of the t-shirt projects in the American Indian Center, and then he would go and sell patches and t-shirts and whatnot on the street corner. Was regularly getting harassed by the cops, and then decided that film this harassment, got put in jail for recording the police, and then fought it. And that was in court for years. And the laws were changed right before he passed away from cancer, and so that was like the legacy he got to leave the city.
And why would the police harass him? What rationale did they give?
Oh, it's just selling things on a license on the corner, just sitting around, loitering, those kind of things. But he was never doing anything really problematic. It was never like causing fights or doing any kind of property destruction or any of that kind of stuff. He was just out there just trying to show people how to express themselves with their art.
Yes. What about the soup kitchens? How did you decide to go into that and work there?
Um,
And how old were you when you started doing that?
I want to say I was about 16.
Oh, okay.
So I went to I was going to say DePaul, De La Salle Institute for high school, and which was an all boys Christian Brothers high school. I was one of the poor kids, so I was like sweeping the halls at after school to kind of pay for my tuition and whatnot.
Yes.
But while I was there, I became an aspirant for the Christian Brothers. So I was going to go and become a man of the cloth. And one of the things that was expected of us at the time was a lot of service. And so some of the service I did was volunteering for the Pilsen YMCA and doing, youth education and whatnot, tutorial services. But the other part of that was going to the soup kitchens. There was a soup kitchen at Providence of God Church over by 18th and Halsted. And we just kind of go
Is it
there.
still there?
It's still there. I love the soup kitchen still there, but the church is still there.
Yes.
And we would gather there and just serve. And initially, it was part of a program that I was doing as a senior at school. But then once I graduated, I just kept doing it. And so I stuck with it for a couple of years until life just kind of took me in other directions. But there's nothing as humbling as feeding people and then sitting down with families who are like out in the streets and hearing the stories and seeing them as real people and recognizing how many of them were just like me when I was growing up and how close I had been so many times in my life to being out in the streets and without any kind of housing or food. And so just be able to pay back that privilege that I had, I think that was an important thing to me.
And so I guess when you were young, you didn't have to go to the soup kitchen, but you could see that the level of poverty, you could see how it affects everybody.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I wouldn't say that we didn't. So we didn't actually have to go to a soup kitchen, but we definitely got food from pantries and from the various religious institutions. We just kind of had a joke that we were some of the religious institutions wanted wanted you to like convert to their religion. So we were whatever we needed to be to get the food. And when it came to some of the Christian groups, we would tell. So I'm I guess traditionally, culturally, religious wise, I fall somewhere in between my Lakota traditions and like a West African Santeria type thing. But my the spaces we were in, everybody expected you to be either Baptist or Catholic or Lutheran or whatever. And so whenever we would go and they would ask us, we would always tell them we were another Christian denomination, and that would get us accepted, but no one would actually force us to actually convert to anything. But eventually, my mom hit a point where she decided she wanted to just be something, and she decided she was going to be Catholic, and we went through the whole process of being confirmed and baptized and all that jazz. But I eventually discovered that wasn't for me and moved on in other directions.
So how do you meld your West African heritage and your Lakota heritage into your art and into your life?
How do I weave them together?
Yes.
I don't know, that's a good question. Part of it is just an issue of visibility. So there's two things. One is I want those pieces of myself to always be visible. But I also recognize that a lot of time when we are talking about tradition and like what is actually visible, a lot of that is a side effect of a colonial influence. And so I'm a big proponent of being okay with playing with our culture to figure out, just like our ancestors did, what are new things we need to do to move ourselves forward. I encourage myself and my kids to do the same thing, and anybody that I work with, but with respect for protocol, with respect for what has worked and how it affects other people. But I feel like there's so many stories and experiences that don't get the time of day. And I would like to see that stuff out there. That's one of the reasons I found myself attracted to, like, a lot of the North African belly dance stuff, just because it is such a fluid release of story in the body.
Mhm.
That it comes natural to the way my body is constructed.
Mhm. When uh, for your when do you know a lot of your heritage, the folklore, the stories of the Lakota and the West African descent area?
When I was an really active storyteller, I did lots of particularly Black American, a little bit of West African stories, lots of Native stories. I told within the Native community all the time. And I told not just Lakota stories, I also told a few Anishinaabe stories and a few Southwestern stories. And then also a few Irish stories, because there's Irish heritage in my system as well. And I like to celebrate. I like to celebrate all of my tribal peoples. So yeah, I do a lot of I have done and do still do a lot of storytelling, and I've tried to find ways to bring that into my game development work. So back in 2012, I published a tabletop role-playing game, kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. It's called Edragor, and it is I like to call it a post-cataclysmic survival horror game. Where it's about tribal peoples who've kind of survived all these terrible things, and now they're trying to rebuild. And there's all these forces trying to tear them apart, but they're trying to figure out who they are in this new world. And it pulls heavily from my native heritage and from my Black African heritage. And so that world is primarily a brown world, with all of these different overlapping cultures. And every culture is kind of an amalgam of other cultures from our real world, but kind of given a fantastic twist to them. And then it has this other thing, which is, so as a youth worker and a social worker for years, one of the things I noticed that was ongoing, and almost like a pandemic in and of itself, was depression. And I was seeing youth suicide rates and adult suicide rates where it's so high. And so that's something that manifested in that work under the guise of, like, a lot of games will do this thing where there's this struggle of good versus evil, right? And in my world, it wasn't so much good versus evil. It was the big struggle was against sorrow, and that there are all these things that would cause sorrow to take root in your heart. And if you weren't witnessed by your kin and your relatives and the people who cared for you, the sorrow would slowly whittle away at what was important to you. So when you had a character, the character was all about what made your character important were your stories. And when you had sorrow, you stopped believing in your stories. And when you stop believing in your stories, you lose access to dream. And if no one witnessed you, once you lost access to dream, you just would fade into this stain on the ground called sorrow stain. And people who witness sorrow stain would then themselves be affected by sorrow, and then the cycle will go on. And so one of the major goals in this setting was to kind of get people playing with the fact that we are experiencing trauma on a regular basis, and we need to find ways to stop and address the trauma so that it doesn't take root inside of us, and so profoundly affect how we engage with the world and how we engage with ourselves.
How many lives have you changed? For instance, well, let's maybe if you have an example of one or two, three, could you let us know? Because when you design games and you help the youth, do you see that the first day they step into your classroom versus when they after they've been working with you for some time, is there a difference? And just tell us some story about some life that you have changed.
Lives that have changed. Excuse me. Oh dear. That's a hard question. I would say a lot, but I guess I try not to think about it because I feel like I could get stuck in, um, you know, I don't know, whatever. But so I think a story that comes to mind off the top of my head is, so for a number of summers, I would run this summer program at DePaul University. I teach at DePaul, and it was in conjunction with the Chicago Housing Authority, and I was doing we had like a one program, my friend Lydia and Calfee, she was coordinator of the whole thing, and she ran a girls documentary program where she taught young ladies how to do film documentaries.
Mhm.
And my portion was the game and graphic design program, or at one point it was called the interdisciplinary design program. And my goal was to expose youth to technology, but not for the sake of the technology, but for the sake of using the technology to express their voice.
Mhm.
So the goal was to show them all these ways that they could express voice. And then at the end of the 6 weeks, the last couple of weeks, they would pick a project
Mhm.
in a type of technology and work with it to say something.
Mhm.
And there's this young man who came into the program, and he was supposed to be a graduating high school senior.
Mhm.
Um, but his reading level was barely like, I'd say, fourth or fifth grade. And we were doing all these things, and he was struggling with stuff. And at one point, I showed them how to do mock-ups and layouts for like magazines and that kind of thing. And that really clicked with him.
Mhm.
And he decided for his final project that he was going to do a magazine. And but he could barely write.
Mhm.
And so I sat down with him a bunch and helped him find pictures and figure out how to lay things out. And I wanted him to kind of come up with a story that he wanted to express. And he wound up coming up with a story about his brother. And there was one day where we were getting close to the day where they had to present all of their work.
Mhm.
And I sat down with him, and he was still trying to get his thing, the way that he wanted it to be. And I was showing him how to kind of wrap words around a picture and how he could use type as an image and use type to kind of punctuate particular types of type and bring them out and use those to kind of frame the experience that he was trying to create.
Mhm.
And so he's working, and then while he's working, he stops and he turns around and he looks at me and he says, every year I get put in a summer program and I just kind of hang out in the back and people just put me somewhere. And like this is the first time I feel like I'm actually learning something.
Mhm.
And he was really happy to be making this thing and to be given the opportunity just to express himself without, like, I wasn't checking his grammar, I wasn't fixing his writing, any of that stuff. I was just saying, hey, just do it.
Mhm.
And once it's out there, we can massage it and make it be what you want it to be.
Mhm.
And he just told me how much it meant to him, and it actually made me teary-eyed, and I had to leave the room. So there's that. There's like when I was doing the work in the Uptown community, um, when after that big community meeting, and we started doing the um, block parties and all that, um, the CHA building that was having all the trouble with people occupying the building,
Mhm.
they went and they put security in the building. And so there's security personnel who had to man the outside of the building and the inside of the building. And I was coming home from work one day, and there's this dad who was coming from the store with his daughter, and he hailed me on the street. I was like a neighborhood dad, so a lot of people knew who I was. Every time I would go out with my kids to play in the park,
Mhm.
people would go, "Oh, Mr. Turner's up there. You can go play." Um, and he pulls me aside and he says, he's like, and he was like very thankful. He said, "Thank you for getting us security in our building. There are these guys who are hanging around. They're harassing my daughters and they're threatening to shoot us. And there's all this stuff going on, and we were terrified and we didn't know who to talk to. And for the first time, we kind of feel safe in our space, and we have you to thank for it." And I was like, "Oh, snap, that feels good." And so there's a piece of me, again, this is also part of like the way I grew up and that abuse space I was in, where sometimes it's hard for me to hear those good words. But it felt I had to receive those good words because that was all that this family had to offer. And if I didn't receive them, that would be I know in my mind that would be an insult to the experience that they were having.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's lots of, I guess there's lots of stories like that. I've got lots of kids in my youth work days who still come and visit me and talk to me and tell me how things are going with them in their life.
Mhm.
Some who've done well, some who aren't doing so well, and even the ones who aren't doing so well are never so ashamed that they won't not come to me. Though if they're having troubles, they'll come and say, "Hey, I need some help,"
Mhm.
and I'll do what I can if I can.
Mhm. Well, it sounds like that young man that you gave autonomy to, he appreciated that. And since he was having trouble reading, asking him to do mock-ups really helped because that was visual, and he had
Yeah.
the creativity in him. He just didn't have the reading skill.
Yeah, he had a great deal of creativity, and once things clicked, and that's always my experience, is that we have this relationship with technology and media that, particularly for kids of color, very often is one of consumership, right? Where our only role with it is to consume what's given to us, but once people realize that they too can express, and they too can create, that tends to really change people's way of engaging with the world and with themselves, because they feel validated. And he felt so validated. And not only did he feel so validated in that, at the end of the program, he came back to me and wanted to figure out how to go to college, where he had no intention of going to college and no capacity to go to college. And we connected him with financial aid. I'm not sure that he was ever able to get into DePaul because DePaul was super expensive, but he was very excited about school at the end of the program, so that was good.
And since you got his energy up, he probably was able to address his reading skills. Maybe he was able to find some way to improve them.
Oh yeah, I mean, he improved in the 6 weeks we were there.
Ah.
Just as his willingness to even write changed, where he didn't want to write anything because of of the struggle it was. And by the end of those 6 weeks, he was a writing machine.
Wow. Wow, that's congratulations.
Yeah.
And how old was the young man?
He was 17.
Oh, there's an American Indian Center down Kimball here.
Yes, that's the same place we moved. So back in 2016, 2015, 2016, the old building had lots and lots and lots of problems. And the community didn't have sufficient funds to fix it. And we had to buy another building altogether. The old building was bought by some other group with lots of money, and they turned it like, again, big condos or whatever. But we wound up going into the old, I think it was an old Filipino American Center. And they moved out, and the AIC moved into that space. And so they've been there for a few years now.
And what is your involvement with them now?
Not as much as it used to be. My traveling and my work has taken me away, but relatively recently I did some storytelling performances there. We did a Black and Indigenous storytelling event back in February, and we did it last year as well. There was a youth group, Chinese Youth Council, that my kids have been a part of, and they further down on Pulaski, I believe it is, they have a medicine garden.
Yes.
And so I would go and do storytelling and activities within there from time to time. Coming up at the AIC though in April, so I'm currently working on a VR project, and I call the VR project Sankofa Seasons, and it's about creating this space.
What does VR stand for?
Virtual reality. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And it's about gathering Black stories. And so what I've been doing is I've been sitting down with Black people, Black American people, and just kind of asking stories about their own survival, and giving them prompts about their own survival, and kind of collecting stories from them. And those stories are being placed into these virtual pots. And so there's this big landscape where the only thing you're really doing is you're traveling the landscape, and you're finding pots and items that contain stories of people, and you bring it back to a place which is basically built to be like an ancestor's altar. And you listen to the stories, and eventually you collect the stories that are important to you, that serve as personal inspiration or medicine for you. So I've been arranging interviews all over the city. I've got some students who are going to be helping me do that, so we can also transcribe those interviews. And so towards the end of April, we'll be doing a showing of this experience at the American Indian Center, and I'll be doing some community story gathering activities there.
Give us more information about that later. I'll help you announce it, and maybe we'll try to get there as well.
I'll pass it on to you. The dates haven't been fully solidified. We have a steering committee that's organizing. There's a grant to fund for the whole doing these community activities at the center. So I'm part of that steering committee. So as the dates come together, I will pass some information on to you.
And you talk about gathering together Black stories of survival.
Mhm.
Are there categories for those stories?
Um, yes and no. So one of the big things I'm doing is I want them to be stories that are coming from common people.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's this thing that happens where we will celebritize certain people and they get put on the pedestal and their stories are the stories we have to look to like say this is how you survive.
Mhm.
When in reality, so many of us have so many ways that we just get through day by day,
Mhm.
and with the daily traumas that come to us. So what I do is I ask questions about particular points and periods in your life, like
Mhm.
how did you survive? What was a standout story for you about your survival as a child, adolescence, the first time you had to step outside of a comfort zone, your experience of being a Black person in America? When was the first time you noticed that your Blackness made you different from other people? How do you relate to your Blackness? Um, what was the first time you saw how wonderful the world could be? It was the first time you saw how frightening and terrible the world could be,
Mhm.
and just kind of. And as they explain those stories, I also ask them to express them in terms of a season.
Mhm.
And so after they've told the story, then the follow up is like, what season in your life would you say that is? Was it a winter where you're up against struggle? Was it summer when you're standing in your strength? Was it a spring where there's new growth? Was it a fall when you were aggregating resources?
Mhm.
Um, and then also to think about what lens do they still carry from that experience that affects how they engage the world, and if they can verbalize that lens in a phrase or in a saying. And I'll use like Spider-Man as my go-to, right? Where Peter Parker has all the craziness that happens that makes him become Spider-Man, but in the process he loses his Uncle Ben.
Mhm.
Um, and from that, he gets his idea of with great power comes great responsibility,
Mhm.
right? And so that becomes this thing that he can use to help him move through hard times, but it also gets him into trouble sometimes too, because he doesn't know when to walk away from certain situations. So asking people to think about things like that, what have their experiences left them with, the colors their view of the world, um, think about the things that are positive, things that are negative, and what can they pass on to another person to help them um, navigate similar situations.
How has this set of questions been applied, if it has, to your album, Musings in Brown?
Oh my goodness. So musings in Brown was a couple of things. One, it was me working through my own depression. So if you can listen to it from beginning to end, there's emotion that moves through there. There's a lot of the pieces also have like these kind of secondary sounds there in the background. They're kind of like a distracting noise, and that's very much the self-doubt talk that's happening in my head. Um, so that was I don't know if those questions directly informed that, but I think making that album helped me to connect to those questions. So it's a combination of
Mhm.
those questions come out of actually the character creation process in my role-playing game. These are
Mhm.
things I ask you to do for the character in your game.
Oh.
And I found that it was useful. And I moved it eventually into doing that with the kids in my youth programs,
Mhm.
so that the first week or so we would sit there and just kind of recount our own survival stories
Mhm.
to build a sense of tribe and kinship amongst everybody, so people could see that nobody was kind of the only person who had been through something. Um, which typically made it really easy after we spent that week of connecting to actually get work done because people
Mhm.
were very supportive of each other. Um, and then I just kind of kept expanding on that idea, and so this is the current form it takes.
Mhm. Uh, and when was Musings in Brown? When did you bring it out?
Oh, 2019, I
Okay.
believe is when I published that. There's been a few albums like, and my relationship with my music really is um something moves through me and I make a piece of music,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
Sometimes I'm just at home late at night by myself and I just start fiddling around with something, and sometimes I'll capture it and go,
Mm.
oh, that was kind of cool. But they're really meditations, if anything. And when I have enough of them, I can kind of capture the narrative of those meditations and I release them. And I'm not really releasing them necessarily to make money. I'm releasing them to get them out my system and say, okay, we're done.
Uh-huh.
And so that's what happens with Musings and Brown and the other albums I have currently up on Bandcamp and Spotify.
Oh, what other albums are there?
You know what? I can't even remember the name. My brain just shut off. But um, I thought we hit my oh, my brain just not working. If you go to Spotify and look up Council Fools Rhythm Council,
Okay.
you'll see all the things I've made. Some of the names are kind of whatever popped in my head at the time, and I attached that to it, and then went on to do something else. So, but they represent a wide range of things. Some of them are very ambient and experimental. Um, what's the Trail? Oh my God, I can't remember my own album names.
That's
I've been talking too much.
okay,
But some are much more experimental, some are more dancey.
Mhm.
Some are, so I think Musings and Browns was much more a collaboration of samples and synthesizers. I got my first synth, which is a old Casio XWP1 that I found in a thrift store. And I brought it home, started playing with it, and said, "Oh my God, this is awesome!" And I deep dived into it and started making music. I wasn't musically trained. I was just kind of playing by ear and finding sounds and taking those sounds and making something more out of them. And working with and putting everything into a DAW, a digital audio workstation. But then I got a little bit of a gear acquisition syndrome and kept getting more. And everything had a different sound, everything had a different feel, and everything connected to a different way I was feeling at a given time when I bought it. So that led to me making all these other pieces. And sometimes I make stuff that I intend to perform with. I haven't yet performed with any of my own music yet. But that is a goal in the near future.
You recently performed the Vulture in Worlds End Worlds Begin.
Yeah.
How did you come to select that piece?
I didn't select that. Kenya, Keo Razin selected that. So it was a Gil Scott Heron poem.
Yes.
And Kenya, either he or a friend of his made a new backing track to it, and then he just did the poem spoken word over that. And he had seen me perform in various other places and asked if I would be a performer while he did that piece. And when I listened to the poem, I realized, oh, this is about a person who really is all red flags. You know, he walks in a room, he's just a predator, ready to kind of take and scavenge whatever he could from people. And so that gave me the idea to take some of these worship flags. But I got these bright, scintillating red worship flags, and I was literally going to be the guy who, when you saw me, I was all red flags. So I was physically manifesting that metaphor. And it was also meant to be a contrast to the more dove-like, peace-like character that I was presenting at the end when I did the performance to Existence Life, where I'm all dressed in white. Yes. So one character is all black and red, and the other person's in all these different shades of white. And one was one was the dangerous person, and the other person was the uplifting person. So. Yes.
Well, Ellen Turner, you are such an amazing artist and amazing person. If our listeners want to learn more about you, where would they go? And if you have performances in the future, where could they find out where to see you perform?
Well, I guess the easiest places to find me online is on Instagram. Kanji Sapa is my Instagram handle.
Could you spell it out?
KANGISAPA. Okay. And then there's counciloffools.com, which is my normal blog. That's council, COUNCIL dash of OF dash fools, FOOLS.com. And that's where I explore a lot of my game design and my play design and just general explorations. And I have on occasion done like some coaching and just kind of talking with friends and family. And so I have this website that's kind of like my quote unquote coaching space, which is called crowmagics.com. CROWMAGICS.com. And that showcases a little more of my dancing performance stuff and just insights about how to move through the world and catch your breath and be a better person.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellen Turner, for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, Ms. Wizard.